say you're being recording in progress. And that way we have some actual evidence that we did this. Cool. So we'll jump right into it. Thanks again to the guys at Turner Motorsport. We'll post some links to the Apex Pro product line at turnermotorsport.com. If y'all aren't familiar with them, you probably are, because most of you are probably here because you got an email from them and saw some information from them, but they obviously make and sell aftermarket parts for BMWs. And kind of got started in motorsports a long time ago with Robby's current boss, Will Turner, and competing at a very high level. So thanks for joining us. Before we get into the content for the webinar itself, if y'all have questions for Robby to answer as we're talking, go into the Q&A box. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a box that says Q&A. You can enter your questions there, just type them in, and that'll pop up with a notification so we know to answer them. The chat box is so you can communicate with one another. And so Ryan and Pat and the other guys can post links to things that might be relevant or you might want to check out. Cool. So I think that's it. Ready to get going. So Robby, how did you get started in racing? You mind starting us off there?
Yeah. So like a lot of people, I got kind of into it through my dad, and I caught a passion for it through him. But I started in go-karts in SCCA autocrossing. Basically, when I was 8 years old, I got this little 1994 Margay go-kart, and was traveling around the country with my dad. He autocrossed at the national level, so we would travel to events like pro solos and national tours back in the day, doing that. Did that for quite a few years. Even ran the national championships in 2008 and the pro solo national championships, and then eventually kind of outgrew the go-kart. I guess I'm 6'3" now, and I think when I was 12 I was about this tall, so I was racing kids that were a lot smaller than me, and the power to weight ratio wasn't working out so well. So I kind of took a hiatus from motorsport for a little while, and was playing football and baseball across the country very seriously. And then I had a bad leg injury playing football, where I tore my ACL, LCL, PCL, and broke my tibia, fibula, and my ankle in a couple places. On top of that, also have nerve damage. So needless to say, that was the end of my football career. And that was kind of a turning point in my life where I wanted to start to pursue motorsport again and racing. And I kind of made a deal with my dad to allow me to go to a skip Arbor school if I got straight A's for 2 marking periods in a row. So I managed to slip by and do that. And then went to a 3-day skip Arbor racing school at Laguna Seca. And from there, it's kind of been, a crazy experience of going from that into SCCA club racing. Right at about that point, my dad started club racing himself from autocross. And he had a 1987 Honda CRX, which we raced in ITB and SCCA, still exists now. And did that for a bit. And that winter, when I turned 15, I think it was 2012, the winter of 2012, Skip Arbor had a promotion running for their regional series, winter series. It was only 3 race weekends, but they had a great scholarship system at the time. And if you finished well enough, they would basically pay for your next level of racing. So I was a product of that system for a long time. I won a few of their scholarships to move up eventually into Mazda MX-5 Cup. And 2016, I ran Mazda MX-5 Cup as a Mazda development driver type of thing. And that kind of kickstarted my career into the pro racing sort of level, which is about the time Andrew and I actually met each other down at Auburn. And then from there, kind of just worked my way up. I got into some LMP3 racing through people I knew at Mazda. And then fast forward into 2018 is when I got connected through a mutual kind of connection to Will Turner and Turner Motorsport, and did a couple of races for them in 2018, and then have since been full-time with Turner Motorsport from 2019 onwards, and done various other things as well in GT racing and prototypes. But my home has been at Turner for the last couple of years, and in BMWs and IMSA and SRO mainly. So it's been a crazy couple of years, but definitely very lucky to be here now.
Yeah, super fascinating story. I think the whole like football injury and if somebody had met you like when I met you, so like 2015 probably, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
2014. Racing driver, definitely like you have more of a football driver physique, football player physique, right? At the
Yeah.
time, you're a
For
lot
sure. Still
trimmer.
do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I kind of do too. And I think that's part of what, like, you and I are both a little taller than a lot of our peers who we were
Exactly. Yeah.
racing with and competing against. And it was cool. Robbie and I met each other because we were at the same school, and my younger brother is actually Robbie's age. And they became good friends just because I guess you guys had like a group that got together and watched
Yeah.
Formula One races and stuff like that.
Exactly. Mutual connection of car people. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's how I kind of got connected. I remember being at Formula SAE competition, talking to Kenton Coke. Do you say his last name Coke?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cook, I guess,
Cook,
technically.
Kenton
Yeah.
Cook, who's another professional, paid racer and coach. And he actually told me about Robbie before I met him and said, you need to keep your eyes peeled for him at Auburn. And so I knew to look out for you, and we got to be fast friends because of that. But because of that relationship, when we started developing Apex Pro, you were one of the people that I looked to say, like, let's stick this in your car and get some feedback.
Yeah.
And it was an MX5 Cup car at the time. And I remember giving it to you for a weekend at Road Atlanta. And you kind of assessing what you thought of the real-time display, and trying to kind of just communicate a little bit of whether it was helpful and what you learned from it and that kind of stuff,
Right.
which really was very fundamental in the development of the product. So you've kind of been involved since the very, very beginning. That was before it was ever a thought in anyone's mind as something they would
Yeah.
buy.
Yeah. Still initial prototypes. I remember a lot of that stuff. And I think, a couple of the displayed iterations and differences there, it was fun times. And I think the final product we ended up testing in your World Challenge car at Arbor,
Yeah.
for that one test that we did and stuff. But yeah, that was good times.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember you sending back like your video with it in the car was really helpful because we made some changes after you ran it at Road Atlanta, because there were certain things we didn't feel like were representative of what we wanted to see in the lights, and
Right.
made some changes. So that was pretty big part of like the formula for where we are now. So um, yeah, we've been friends and involved together for quite a while. But the topic of the webinar here is obviously intro to driving on track, or intro to motorsports. And you talked about the autocross kind of format. I know some folks already mentioned that they do autocross. And by the way, folks, if you're just joining us, I see we have a few more folks that are on. Let us know in the chat box what kind of car you drive, what type of events you aspire to do. If you're not driving already, if you are driving, what events are you doing? Track days, autocross, wheel-to-wheel racing. Just let us know some information about yourself. But is that a good, I know you kind of had an easy end to it because your dad was, I don't want to say easy end, but you had an avenue to pursue since your dad kind of channeled that interest, into you.
Yeah.
Autocross is kind of the obvious starting point, I guess.
Yeah. I think it teaches you a lot of great things. For me at the time, it was what I had access to. It's what we could afford. And it was a great way to get an introduction to driving. I mean, you learn car control very quickly. An autocrossing environment and the speed and kind of frequency of corners are a little bit more intense or severe than a road course. Like on an autocross track, over 45 seconds, you could have 45 corners, where on a racetrack you have, unless you're at the Nürburgring, you have more like 17 to 20 tops on the longest tracks we have in North America. So it's a very different style in a way, but the general driving and car control and tactile feedback you get from the car and stuff is very similar. And I think there's some skill sets that apply very well to both disciplines. Like we were talking about this earlier. Like I just raced at Long Beach a couple of weeks ago, or 2 weeks ago, and I'd never been there before. And a skill I learned from autocrossing early in my career was always to learn a track quickly. We used to walk the autocross course in the morning before driving it, and similarly you walk a racetrack and you're able to pick up these cues and visuals based on your experience. For me, in my case, when I was 8 years old. So that's a great skill, and just being able to learn on the fly. And at the national level, in the national events like a national tour or the championships, you only get 3 runs and that's it per course. So you really have to nail, in basically 3 laps the track as well as you can. So that's a very valuable skill, I think, that translates more into racing than people really realize. And there was always a joke that among autocrossers that a great autocrosser can make a great road racer, but a great road racer is always a terrible autocrosser, which is kind of true.
Kind of true.
Yeah. So I loved my start in that because it was a great way to learn a lot of basic skills, and I had a lot of my dad's friends kind of giving me advice and tips and tricks, and it was a great time in my life. Really enjoyed it for sure.
Yeah, that's some awesome. You know, I think that does kind of ring true. Like you know, if you're watching this now, you know, a lot of people get into track days without having done autocross because that was just their path to it, whether it be because they bought a Porsche and they got introduced through the local club, or BMW, kind of same thing. See that a lot. And that's how a lot of people get to the track. And sometimes they have to backtrack and go back to autocross. But I've really commonly seen, I'm sure you do too, Robbie, that people that like have a lot of that autocross competency and skill set tend to really be able to pursue the limit of the tire in a track environment. And sometimes if you're trained in road racing, going back to autocross is not easy. Yeah,
they're definitely very different disciplines, but I think the biggest thing is in an autocross, you have things like slalom courses and really you're always in an autocross scenario preparing for what's coming next. So I use a lot of terms that are kind of autocrossing terms at different racetracks, like at Coda, the S's, for instance. I treat that as almost like a slalom course, and you're always trying to get behind the last apex to open up the next one. We used to say that all the time in autocrossing, like, okay, here you would get behind this cone, and it's, you know, more or less an apex. So definitely those kind of techniques and stuff really transfer well, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw something in the chat. I think Trevor Morissette asked a question about basically, this is just to say, Trevor, if you can copy and paste that question in the Q&A, that'd be super helpful because it cues it up in a way that makes it obvious to Robbie and I as presenters that you're asking a question. But you basically said pick a class and build a car for that class, or like basically how do I go from HPDE to jump to wheel-to-wheel racing? That's an awesome question. I don't want to miss it. So if you can dump that into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, that'd be great. So also, we just launched a poll while you were talking a second ago, Robbie. I created a poll and it says, what type of motorsports do you participate in? And about 85% of folks so far have filled it out. And it looks like 59% of people on the webinar do track days in HPDE, about 24% do wheel-to-wheel racing, and 18% do autocross. So
yeah, we got a good mix then.
Yeah, a lot of variety, but also a lot of kind of dominant track day folks. Walt jumped in, said he drives a Subaru BRZ, NASA Great Lakes. Got a couple more folks with E46 M3s. Awesome. Yeah, got quite the variety. Yeah, I think that's really interesting because we talked about autocross and how some people kind of write it off once they get into doing track stuff, but particularly if you're budget minded, or even if you have the budget to do whatever you want to do on the track, I think it's honestly a really good idea to pursue some autocross if you haven't spent time in that. You know, like personally, one of my goals for next year is to actually go do more autocrosses with Ryan, because there's plenty locally that I can get to. I just have to set aside a day to do it. It's a little bit, you know, someone like me, Robbie, are the same way. I get paid to be at the racetrack. It's a little hard to justify the time to go somewhere where I'm not on a weekend. I'd rather be at home, but at the same time, I know it's going to help me a lot to get back into that environment. We'll go ahead and serve up a question from Jamie Monahan, if that works for you.
Sure. Let's do it.
Robbie, he says, Robbie, at what point did you become financially independent from your dad in racing? So what was the magic times or series that enabled that? So, you know, your dad supporting you, you know, most of us have that scenario. I did the same thing, right? My dad was willing to help me. I think any parent that can help their kids get a unique life experience and can support it financially do that, right? Whether it's racing or riding horses or playing tennis or whatever. And so he was basically asking what circumstances or what did you do to enable yourself to kind of move into financial independence?
That's a good question. I think it's something very unique about racing as a sport is that it's quite expensive and the avenues into it aren't so obvious, right? So I guess I would say obviously through autocrossing, I was, 8 to 12 years old. So my dad was, funding that situation. And then when we would race the Honda CRX, I would do a little bit to try to chip in with just a little bit of money that I had, but my dad was still paying for it more or less. And then I would say, honestly, it was fairly early in my career where I became financially independent based on circumstance, and was when I initially went in to skip Arbor. I forget exactly, but the initial fee was something like 25 grand. And my parents put up that money for me to go and do it. And then after that, I started earning these scholarships. And the racing after that more or less paid for itself. Here and there, like my travel, I couldn't afford, right? So my parents would buy me plane tickets and stuff. But I definitely did it on the super cheap. And that's, just circumstance, what I was able to do and what I had to work with. I often would drive, to racetracks. I've slept in my car before. I've done all the crazy stuff that you hear about people doing. But at the same time, I was very fortunate to have, some support from my parents that if I didn't have that initial investment, I would definitely not be where I am today. So I would say probably to be completely financially independent, like I was paying for my own travel and stuff, I was probably right around 18 or 19, but my parents would still help me out here and there when I needed to. But luckily the past couple of years I've been able to sustain myself as through coaching and racing and stuff. So I've kind of made it to the level where people dream of making it. Hopefully I can stay there, I guess. But yeah, hopefully that answers the question, I guess.
Yeah, and you're only 25 now?
Yeah, I just turned 25, so
yeah,
quarter century old, but still young, I guess.
yeah. So that's that's a really good question, because I think the financial element of it is such a big such a big thing, and no matter if you're coming at it from having a lot of means, starting later in life maybe, or in a certain situation, or coming at it from where Robby came from, and having a desire to do it and basically pursuing. It's like a need. It's like because I was kind of in the same situation where my parents were willing to help me to an extent,
right?
But they would never contribute. And your parents are the same. Your dad wouldn't help pay for your travel if you didn't show that you were genuinely interested and had a passion for it and pursued it, right?
Right. Like I had to have skin in the game in a way. And for me, honestly, my parents never were like crazy about the idea of me racing. Like my dad always was very realistic with me, and he came from a very humble background, and he's like, this is not exactly a common career to pursue, and one that's going to necessarily be very easy or safe, so my parents definitely let me do my own thing, if that makes sense. So I was kind of responsible for myself in a lot of ways, because it's not like they were definitely supportive. I'm not trying to say they weren't, but at the same time they were realistic in saying, like, this is not exactly we still want you to try to go to school, and you might have to work at a desk if this is not a sure thing at all.
We can't fund you to Formula One. Yeah,
exactly. Like, so they were always very realistic, and I was never pushed at all by my parents to pursue this. I definitely, like, from the time I went to Auburn, actually, when I was about 18, from that point, in the next couple of years, what shaped my career, that was totally separated from, my parents' involvement, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Do you think there's an element of, well, I'll start with this. A lot of times, people get into motorsports if you're coming at it from getting started in middle age or later in life, when, maybe you're making more money, you have plenty of expenses, and life is happening, right? But you can maybe contribute more money to your hobby.
Right.
Do you find that there's almost an element of like creating some scarcity, because motorsports is so driven by dollars, right? More dollars means you can go faster, it means you can do more events, it means all these things. But you don't, when you're like, as you and I kind of were, 18 years old, just wanting to do it, having somebody that's kind of enabling you and like pushing you off the cliff a little bit, but not quite with a parachute.
Yeah.
You kind of have to figure out how to fly on your own. Do you think there's an element of like, if you're just getting into it later in life, can you create that kind of same, like the reason that you and I both pursued what we did is because we wanted it so bad and we didn't have the money necessarily to spend to do something. We couldn't always buy new tires or couldn't buy rain tires or couldn't do whatever. And you
Yeah.
learn a lot of things that you don't learn if you can throw money at the problem. Do you think there's a
Absolutely.
way that people that even if you have money and can dedicate a significant budget to it, can you still learn those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think it all comes down to how hungry you are to do a certain thing, right? Like it all starts out as a hobby for everyone. And I think all of us here are passionate about racing or cars or just track driving or, high performance vehicles in general, right? So we all have the same goal or we all have the same passion, but um, I think it's uh, it's a different kind of sport in that you generally get out of it what you put into it in terms of money, yes, but also in terms of effort. Like just because you spend more money on your car doesn't necessarily mean you're a better driver. And we were discussing this earlier, like obviously if you're going to go to the track, what's more important, improving your car or improving yourself? And I 100% would argue that improving yourself as a driver is better until you're limited by the car that you're in. And we see that a lot where some people, overextend themselves a bit early before they're ready to take the next jump. But I mean, I think anybody that's focused and passionate about driving and is willing to put in the time definitely will see. They'll get they'll get out of it what they put into it.
Yeah, that's definitely a common theme, because we've all been at the track when you get passed by somebody in HPD who's just got a more expensive car than you do.
Yeah.
But I've also worked with people who I know are like, is that me? Right.
Right.
And no one wants to be that person. Everyone wants to be skillful. Um, so establishing your skills and finding a way to get in, there's a balance. That hard work element has to match the financial. You can't fix the problem with money. And anyone that has, I think something that we find, like that I find when I work with clients as well, I'm sure you find this a lot, but most of the time, people are coming into motorsports with a little bit of money further into life where they've been successful in another field. And I think a lot of times, because this is a hobby and it's fun, it's really easy to kind of turn your brain off and just be like, yeah, I need new tires, I need new whatever, I'm just going to buy it, not a big deal, it's not going to be stressful, I'm just going to show up at the track. And that whole idea of using it to relax and using it for fun sometimes can kind of mute that you still need to be really dedicated and focused and passionate about this in order to attain a certain skillfulness, I guess. And that's where I see a lot of people that if I just need to spend a couple $1,000 more to make the car faster, I'll do it instead of spending a couple more hours on me and my preparation to be, developing my awareness or developing my whatever skills I'm lacking that I need to improve.
Yeah.
It's like it's not as easy as just spending money on it. It's like starting a business. It's like
Yeah.
going somewhere in your career. It's like getting married, right? I got married a few years ago. Like it's you have to put into it what you want to get out of it, which is
Yeah.
exactly what you said. That's a super
Yeah.
relevant
And you
thing.
see that in track driving and HPDE all the way up to racing. Like there's plenty of drivers I've competed against, throughout my career that have had a lot of money behind them, which doesn't necessarily make them as hungry. And then all of a sudden they run for so long and they never are forced to develop themselves to the level they really need to be at to sustain that professional level without, if they don't have the funding, they're not going to be there. The same can be said for HPDE or club racing. You need to also put in some effort to make yourself better you can spend as much as you want, but then when you get to a level where everybody else is spending the same, you have to also be able to perform.
Yeah, that's really good stuff. Let's jump into some more Q&As. I'll throw the first one at you, Robbie. You might probably already seen it, but Andy's wondering, Robbie, when you drive, do you get the lights at max grip on the Apex Pro?
Well, that's always the goal for sure. I would say, I mean, anytime I've used the device, it's helped me, or it just reaffirms what I'm what I'm trying to feel or what I'm analyzing in a way. Like, your first couple laps, you're probably, obviously the device is learning, but you're probably not maximizing, the limit of the tire in every phase of the corner, especially if it's your first session, you're kind of warming up a little bit. But yeah, I would say so. I would like to think so. It would be cool to put it in, one of the cars I drive regularly now, and see what, if we can be green all the time. That would be quite cool. But that's
right.
always the goal, right? So
I bet we can get it in the Turner IMSA GTD car.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the to kind of go off of that, because we talked about earlier in the webinar, Robby was what kind of helped us develop it, and so we took data like, the data that he produced from driving it, and these early prototype models lived on that device, and so we were able to see what a driver of his caliber is doing and how they're manipulating the car, and that's a very important thing when you're trying to establish an algorithm that does what the Apex Pro device does, which we can certainly talk more about if people have more questions. But so I would say, yeah, Robby's probably part of probably a lot of Robby's driving, a lot of my driving are baselines for what the Apex Pro does. Yeah. So it's good to know. It's good to know the two of us. Let's go to Grant's question. He says he struggles to keep the rear end from sliding out at track days in my E46 wagon. Sweet. I'm able to do fine in tight technical sections, but any big sweeping fast corners, it gets dicey. So any tips to driving in a rear heavy car better?
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that's a problem is probably coming from a few different causes. It depends a lot about what you're doing with your feet. So if you're driving in too quickly into the corner and losing the rear that way, or if you could be under driving the corner and snapping on the throttle too early and causing like an oversteer. To tell you exactly what's happening, I'd probably need a little bit more detail, but one thing that's always interesting to consider too is why the event's happening, or what are the lead-ups to why the event happens. You could honestly be having an understeer that as soon as you understeer through the corner, the front is sliding, or the front is overslipped and the rear has grip, and then by the time the front actually grips up as you go back to the throttle, you have an oversteer induced by an understeer. That's a technique, or not a technique, a situation that a lot of people overlook. When they're giving feedback or they're trying to analyze what's happening, they say, oh, I have this snap oversteer on the exit. Well, it could also be the fact you had understeer and you have so much steering input into it that by the time the front actually grips up, the front's so positive that the rear snaps around. So I'm going to go back to, I'm going to read the rest of your question to see if there's more detail in it. But yeah, I would say in tight technical sections, if you're doing okay, it has something to do with speed and radius, right? If you're in a hairpin corner and you can brake quite well and then get through the corner fine and you have good traction, you're probably just overdriving the lateral limit of the tire, which can happen at any level or any grip level of a tire. I'm going to guess you're on some kind of street-based tire, so it has tread and it's got some good grip, but also not the highest level of grip. But I would say you need to drive the car within the window of grip that you're given. And in a sweeping fast corner, it gets dicey. You probably just need to adjust the amount of speed that you're trying to carry into the corner. Again, I'm speculating here. I'd have to have some more detail to tell you for sure. But
what would help is if we had some Apex Pro data.
That's true.
We could probably tell you in detail exactly what you're doing now, and then how you could fix it. So that's a totally blatant product plug. But the reality there is, Grant, I think what Robby's trying to say is, like, are you, especially in a fast sweeping corner, a lot of times you want to commit back the power sooner in the corner to get the rear loaded so that you're not over gripping the front on the entry. Yeah. And obviously the speed is going to be very critical. Are you just trying to carry too much speed and dealing with that?
Yeah, a good way to kind of say that is you're either underloading the rear or overloading it. So if you're underloading it, the rear is unsettled and you have too much weight on the front. So say you're braking quite hard and the rear is light because it's underloaded, right? Then you have an oversteer on entry or off throttle, or it's overloaded as you kind of come off the brake laterally and the car doesn't quite take a set and it will slide like that. That's how it would be overloaded laterally. Or if you pick up the throttle too soon, too early, or too aggressively, and you have a sharp weight transfer to the rear, then you're overloading the rear tire and having a slide. So yeah, without knowing more detail, we can't necessarily say if you're underloaded or overloaded in a way.
Yeah.
But
Guys, if you're listening and you like some of this technical conversation, I'll ask Ryan to post some of the links to the previous webinars. Robbie and I've done a webinar on braking, actually 2 webinars on braking and 1 on passing. And those were quite a while ago. So we're going to post a link. You guys can watch those for free. They're unlisted on our YouTube channel, so it'd be pretty hard to find without us posting it here. So he's going to drop that in the chat. So I'd recommend pulling that up in another browser and saving it for when you have an hour to watch kind of a Q&A style webinar like this with some presenting material where we'll go into detail, particularly on braking. But that could be a whole nother webinar topic, Robbie, is how to approach fast corners, because the way you approach a high-speed corner from a technique standpoint from feet and hands is a little different sometimes.
Yeah, and it definitely depends a little bit on what sort of car you're in, what kind of platform you have. Do you have any aero? Do you have, front engine car, rear engine car? Where's the weight bias? All that kind of different stuff. But yeah, we've done some in-depth ones before where we break down really specific details on different braking techniques, brake release, threshold braking, all that kind of different stuff, different types of corners. So that'd be good stuff.
Super quick question on that. When just first thought, I guess, let's say that he's got, his tire pressures are kind of within a window that he's fine-tuned and he's happy with, tires aren't overheated, not really attacking the corner too quickly. So he wants to make a change with the car. He's being nice and smooth with his hands and feet. What would be the first place that you would go to where you would say committing to turn into a fast corner, trying to go back to power, the rear end is unstable? What type of setup change would you make if you had tire pressure, shocks, anti-roll bars?
So a good way to think about setup is it's always like a bell curve. You can be on both sides of the problem. So you could be undersprung or oversprung, right? And the way I think about it is every setup change you make to the car is affecting the wheel rate and the way the car transfers weight. So you could have, let's go with undersprung. If you're undersprung, you're having kind of like what's called the roll oversteer, where the car rolls and the tire is accepting the roll to a certain point where then the tire almost folds under itself because the car doesn't have, or the corner doesn't have enough support. So that's one case where as you're loading the rear is all good until then it snaps. And then the reality there is you probably don't have enough support in that, area of the car. So you can attack that in many different ways with spring, sway bar, damper, ride height, even in a way. But generically, let's say in a very common scenario, like again, it's always a bell curve. You could be on the wrong side of what I'm about to say, but you'd probably go for softening something, right? If you have an adjustable sway bar, you'd probably go one position softer. If you have adjustable dampers, you'd go a couple clicks of compression softer, high speed or low speed, depending on your valving. But again, that's a generic explanation for a very, descriptive, specific problem. But I would say if you're, 9 times out of 10, not necessarily 9 times out of 10, let's say, 60% of the time, if you're lacking grip at a specific part of the car, front or rear, going softer in some sort of setting will probably gain you grip. But I've also had numerous times where we've been on the other side where we're too soft, especially on a tire I'm driving a lot on this year, the Pirelli. The construction of the tire requires quite a different setup than the Michelin. So I'm driving the same exact car on 2 different tires, and this setup doesn't even look remotely the same. So that's always, it all comes down to what tire you're on too. It's all about the tire and making the tire happy, because that's what's giving you grip and that's what's contacting the road. So these these questions aren't so easy to answer because they're very variable.
That's kind of why I threw it at you.
Yeah.
It's like the question, what tire pressure do I run?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question.
Great,
I mean,
yeah, great question. If it was as easy as asking that question, then we'd all already have it figured out.
30
Yeah.
PSI is probably a great place to start in every tire, but you
Right.
need to go up or down. But 30, you'd probably get around safely.
That's actually a really good answer. Ryan and I are giving a presentation this weekend on tires. Let's probably start at 30.
Yeah. You're not going to have an issue there. I mean, you might not be
You're
at your
good.
optimal. It'll be safe.
Right. Whether you're on all terrains or all seasons or track tires. Michael Clark. All right. Hey, Mike. He says, can you talk about how you use your sim to improve and prepare? Also, rig tour, what equipment are you using? We knew it would come up.
Sure. Well, here it is.
Knew someone would ask about the sim.
It's right there. Yeah, so I've always been into sim racing, not as serious as I am now, but with COVID, we kind of had some time off last year, as everybody knows, and I got more into it through BMW and through BMW, I joined a sim team called BS Competition, and we've been sim racing at a professional level, let's call it. So to answer your question, to improve and prepare, there's a lot of great things about simulator technology that can help in real life to help with practice and stuff. As we know, it's difficult to get practice. It's expensive and time consuming, right? So the sim is a great way to supplement that. I would say the technique you use is very similar or the same to driving in real life. Like how I attack a corner or what you do with your feet and hands are exactly in line generally with real life. So it's great in terms of muscle memory, but also practicing like the theory of driving, why you would do a certain thing or why you would brake in a certain way, things like that. I compare data often between, for instance, iRacing has an M4 GT4, and I race an M4 GT4 in real life. So I've been able to compare data from the sim to real life, and I actually helped iRacing develop that car through the real life data and stuff. So there's plenty of parallels. Put it very simply, also, it's a great tool for exercising your concentration, because I would argue that the sim is even more difficult to be focused 100% than in real life, because in real life, it's a bit of a physical environment. You're fighting the car a little bit. It's very hot. It's not an environment you're thinking about what you're having for lunch. You're 100% focused on what's going on, and if you're not, you're in a wall, right? Or in the sim, it's less physically taxing, let's say. So it's easier to focus on like, I'm kind of hungry. What am I going to have for lunch, or that kind of stuff. So to maximize your performance in the sim, you have to be incredibly mentally tough and have a lot of focus. And I think that's the biggest thing I use it for, outside of just, kind of testing my reflexes and staying in tune with driving a car, is if I can do a 2-hour stint on the sim perfectly, I know I'm ready to get after it in the real car, and I'll be way better off, and I can drive with less brain power. It helps your subconscious a lot as well.
That's critical. You don't hear people talk about that a lot, but it just gives you more capacity because your brain's used to.
Yeah. And brain capacity is a huge thing, especially like if you can use in an endurance race less energy to do the lap time and less energy to win the race or lead the race. And very simply put, you're going to be way better off over your competition.
You want to do just like a super quick sim tour? Like what's critical there that you're running?
I can try just on my laptop, but so you can see it's a triple screen setup. It's not really going to work. But I'll point. That's fine. So I have 3 screens basically that they kind of give you a very immersive feel. Like the field of view is pretty realistic to where you would sit in the real car. It's obviously a little bit distorted, but it gives you a good immersive kind of 3D feel in the car, and it helps with depth perception a lot. Some people ask, why don't I use VR, or why not use VR? I find the depth perception in VR more difficult to kind of calculate, where on the screens it's much more realistic, and the screens are easier on your eyes for long periods of time. I also use a SimuCube wheel motor, which is a servo direct drive engine motor that can produce a massive amount of power. Like, I can turn the motor all the way up, and I actually physically can't turn the wheel. So it has enough power to produce similar steering forces to what we have in real life. And then I use Huiskenveld pedals, which are quite realistic. Like, the brake pressure I'm using is fairly close to real life. And yeah, the brake pedal has a pretty good feel. And beyond that, it's a static sim rig, so I don't have any motion. I think motion can be good, but only if it's really, really well tuned, and those systems are quite expensive and not super practical for my apartment. They're quite big. Yeah, beyond that, a powerful PC and a lot of sim software. And with the team I'm on, we have a lot of really, really smart people that kind of design background programs. So we have like our own strategy and timing system, where it receives data and does these calculations, which actually lost me a race once because I set it to the wrong setting, and it wouldn't let me overwrite it. So
Oops.
it was almost like, when people joke about robots taking over the world, it literally was that exact thing. Yeah, I'm a big advocate of sim racing, and just as a training tool. Saying that, it will never replace the real thing. You can't just take, I would say this: a very, very good sim racer has the ability to become a very good real life racer, but it's no guarantee, because there's a big physical element of it, and a fear element. In the sim, if you crash, you reset, it's all good. In real life, it obviously hurts, and it's expensive, and has more consequence.
For sure.
So
yeah. So if you're not sim racing, that's a great way to allocate some of that personal improvement budget, or maybe don't buy a set of tires or set of brake pads, and invest in some sim time and carve out a night a week. I personally need to do that. I probably haven't done iRacing since, like, I don't know, since I stopped racing full time. I just, and I'm granted, I'm at the track now more than I ever have been.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's less of a necessity in my situation. But
Right.
George Baker had a great question. I listened to an interview with Bill Overland, who co-drives with some Robby Foley guy. Super weird. He said the comment was the traction control in the M4, M6 were awesome. I've since read that the traction control for the race cars is significantly different than the stock traction control. One, just can you comment on that? And two, if you were driving a stock BMW M car, what setting would you run on the traction control?
Very good question. So a couple of things just to preface a few things. So all the street car stuff has been developed in race cars generally, right? So, but that's just a quick thing. So traction control in race cars, yes, it's very, very different in how we use it. The technology and the programming is very, very similar, but for us, it's not a safety tool, or it's 100% used as a performance gain. So you can still spin our car very easily with the traction control. Like, if you just floor it and don't catch the rear, like, the TC will intervene, but it's not a means to an end, if that makes sense. Where in a lot of scenarios, like in BMWs and Porsches and a lot of cars with very high tech TCs and stability controls, it does save you very well, right? So the difference is how it interacts, I would say. Again, in the race car, we can tune, in the GTD car, we can tune the traction control independently. Like, we have a lot of free reign to change it. In the M4 GT4, it's more or less fixed, right? So in the GTD car, we're really kind of tuning slip targets. So at different speeds, we're looking for different drivability responses and stuff. But probably the most main parameter is the slip relationship between the front and the rear tires. So we have a slip target, and basically that's allowing X amount of slip from the rear more than the front. And if you have no TC, obviously you can do a burnout and spin the rear tires quite fast. But that interaction is basically allowing a percentage of slip more in the rear, and we're trying to basically maximize that for traction. And this working with the tire, and again, like driving the M6 on 2 different tires, we have very different TCs for the different tires. So I would say that's kind of the main difference is how we use it, and why. The technology is more or less the same. We have less yaw control, or really no yaw control, because again, we're not necessarily trying to use it for the same effect. Like Bill and I control the yaw in our driving. We're more looking for aid in traction, and we're using it to help our rear tires.
You want to get out of the corner better, right?
Yeah, exactly. We're just trying to maximize our acceleration, right? So we can do that quite well with our feet, but we also have the aid of the traction control. What's interesting is that he and I often run quite different traction control settings. I generally run less than Bill, and he runs quite a bit more. He's very, very clever at how he uses the TC, and he locks it on a lot earlier in the corner than I do, where I tend to drive more with my right foot, controlling the slip that way. There's also certain corners where we turn it off because it's a bit better to have that kind of extra slip. But there's a lot of other parameters like bumps. When you take bumps into account, we have bump detection and bump control that we can tune. Sometimes it's better for us to turn the TC off, but sometimes we tune it how it comes in over a bump, at street courses, for instance, etc. So hopefully that covers that side of the question. If I was driving a stock BMW M car, what would be the best setting? So I drive an M8 competition day to day, and honestly, I'm pretty much on full on all the time. I'm kind of a grandma on the street. Honestly, I don't really drive too fast on the street.
Yeah, I feel you there.
I'm kind of a risk averse type of guy. I'm very calculated, I would say. But Every now and then you throw it on MDM or off for a bit of fun. But I think BMW does a great job with their MDM. It basically allows you enough leeway to have fun, but it's also, again, saving you all the time. And one thing that you'll find in MDM or full traction on, or DCC with the stability control and stuff, is the kind of, different people call it different stuff, but how the yaw control works with activating the brakes. So if you get in a big slide, the brakes actually come on in different corners at different times through the ABS to straighten the car back out. So that's stuff we don't have in racing generally, because they call it more of a safety thing, but that's something you'll find in your street car that we don't have in the race car.
That's all super interesting. What does MDM stand for? That's kind of BMW's like sporty stability control setting?
Yeah, it's
if you're on the spot, you don't. I know you should know, but
acronym. Now I'm failing the test for sure, but I used to know what it was. But yeah, basically it's an active sport setting in the TC. So actually in our in a lot of the BMW race cars, like the M2 CS racing and the M4 GT4, the original software version, they had an MDM in there. It was just a race tune version of it. So that, again, like it's very similar technology. The MDM we have in the race car is derived off of the street car one. It uses the same ECU even. So it's just a different tune for it, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's probably very similar to Porsche has the PSM, Porsche Stability Management.
Same exactly.
Yeah. PSM Sport, GM has the same kind of traction control settings. And there's typically, most of the manufacturers these days have one that's intended for track use. And that's usually what I recommend, because a lot of modern cars are designed with those systems in mind, that they're going to have them working.
Right.
So it's usually a lot safer. But I definitely think in general, it's good to know, like in your case, Robbie, leaning on the traction control in your environment, you probably are acutely aware of when it's intervening and when it's not. And when and you know how to respond to it if you want it or don't want it. Whereas I've been with many drivers on the racetrack, particularly in my time with the Porsche school, where they are very unaware that the stability control is engaging.
Yeah.
That's when it's a bad thing.
Yeah, exactly.
You need to know.
In my early career in coaching, I was definitely saved many, many times by PSM or the McLaren one. ton of, yeah,
Many right seat coaches appreciate the PSM. Yeah,
exactly. Leave that on for sure until you're really ready to take it off. But
that's
yeah,
right.
that's all very modern technology that really starts in racing, and it uses very it's a complicated system generally and complicated programming, but it uses wheel speed sensors and different yaw sensors in some cases and stuff like that. So all stuff we use in racing for different parts of our race car that are just tuned in a different way.
Yeah. Ryan says it's M dynamic mode is what it stands for.
Yeah, that's probably right.
We'll get to Trevor's question real quick. It's basically he was taught to shuffle steer at his first HPDE ever since. They've said to keep hands at 9 and 3 at all times. What do you think? Shuffle steer 9 and 3?
Definitely 9 and 3. The only time that you should really shuffle steer is if you have a really slow steering rack and a very big steering wheel. Like in my dad's ITB CRX, he had this massive steering wheel. Why, I don't know. And you couldn't do anything but shuffle steer. So I did that in that car. But generally, it gives you better control to not shuffle steer because it's very easy to lose where you are in a way. So yeah, you never really see proper race drivers shuffle steering, and that's for a reason, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head. It's extremely car dependent when it comes to like if you drive a 944, Trevor, I'm not sure what you're driving. Yeah. Trevor, let us know if you drive something that's 80s, 90s, you're probably in many cases on a tight corner on the racetrack. You're going to get to where you're bumping, your arms up against each other in the rack. And in that case, that's when a little shuffle steer method, or I like to do the hand over hand. I'm not sure about you, Robbie, but when I run out of lock, I just like to bring my lower hand back around.
Yeah.
And that keeps more contact with the wheel. But that's a really good question. That's a hotly debated topic. A lot of old cars with like recirculating ball, not a steering rack, but a box, recirculating ball, like steering box, required some more of a shuffle steer. But I think you don't see any onboards in IMSA with guys doing any of that. Granted, you have a rack and a little wheel that's, looks like that. Right.
And in modern race cars, even down to like touring cars or GT4 cars. And it's funny, like I was talking to Bill Arbor about this once, and he sort of he was kind of at the time where it started happening, and he was like one of the first to do it. Is they started cutting steering wheels up and basically only making like a Formula car style steering wheel, because that's where your hands go, and the steering racks are so quick that you don't need the top of a steering wheel. So funny enough, on our Turner golf cart, there's actually a steering wheel that Bill Arbor used to use in a car long ago. And that's our golf cart steering wheel. And it's like an OMP steering wheel with the top cut off of it. So
that's super cool.
In the modern day, we don't really have a round steering. I haven't driven a race car with a round steering wheel since quite a long time. I'm trying to think if there was one this year, maybe just messing around in something, but no race cars really have round steering wheels anymore.
Yeah. Crazy. Yeah, very impractical for a street car, though, not to have a round steering wheel, as Elon Musk and Tesla are finding out. Parking lots, not so good for not. More difficult. Yeah, you want it to be round in that scenario. Jamie Monahan, if you're more serious about advancing your racing career, whether amateur or not, are the budget racing series, not naming names, Champ Car, Lucky Dog, I'll name the names, worth the time, Lemons, worth the time and effort? I know more track time is always good, but is your time and money better spent in more traditional racing series or perhaps a school series? That's not a negative thing. That's just, I think that's who Jamie's talking about when he says budget racing series.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I actually, I did a Champ Car race last year with one of my friends in a Mini, and it was fun. It was also shocking in some ways what was going on track. And I would say some of those races are sketchy in a way because not a lot of people have a lot of experience, but it's a great way to get experience. It's very circumstantial, honestly, to say what's better. I would always advocate for something with a bit more structure and a bit more competition. Not to say you can't have good racing in Champ Car or something like that, Lemons, the equivalent. But I find the cars are very, or most often, they make all the speed in different ways. So you have some car that's super quick on the straight. I was in a Mini Cooper, for instance, which did about 100 miles an hour, but was very quick in the corners relative. But I pretty much raced against nobody. I just would pass people on the outside in corners, and then they would pass me on the straight and whatever. And I wasn't really learning much about racecraft, right? So there's a lot of other series that are coming up recently, like WRL and AER and stuff like that. I think that's, again, in terms of budget, a little bit more expensive than a Champ Car Lemons equivalent. But for me, it's about competition and racing really good people. It doesn't matter what kind of car you're in, really. It could be Spec Miata, could be improved touring, could be some SCCA class, NASA, Grid Life, WRL, anything. But if you have to have good competition and somebody to gauge yourself against. So I guess you'd call that a more traditional racing series, and a school series for sure. Generally, you're racing the same car. So when I started, I was racing in Skip Arbor, and everybody was in a Mazda MX-5, and you knew generally that if you were slow, it was because of you and not the car, right? So that takes that variable out of the equation. So
Yeah.
I would always go for something like a spec series, more competitive. If you're really focused on improving yourself, that's where you want to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple things, and actually, Jamie and I are co-driving a car at a Champ Car race together at the end of the year. So we'll probably learn some things to get there together. But you don't see a lot of guys that come back and do the budget endurance series. They got fast because they raced in the budget endurance series.
Sure.
Most people that get started through that path find another place where they, particularly in an endurance racing in a car that is likely to not finish the race, you have to drive a little differently than in a car that is going to finish the race in the sprint racing environment. So I think there's something to be said for competing in a hotly contested class with similar equipment. And also, the advice I didn't hear until too late in my driving career was race in the series that you can afford to win in, not just the series you can afford to race in.
Yeah.
Because the budget between winning and racing are very, very different. Sometimes you can get to the table or you can get to the track relatively cheaply, but if you need to rebuild a set of shocks to be competitive, all of a sudden the budget's changed. So just studying and knowing, actually the latest Road and Track came out with a pretty interesting just kind of budget comparison to different racing series. We'll look at Grant's question here. And guys, we're at an hour now. We'll go about another 15, 20 minutes or so and then try to wrap it up. So if we don't get to your question, should be able to get to all the questions that are asked now, but if we don't, then we can answer it over email or something like that. Grant says he's running Falcon Azena RT 615s and 265, 45, 18 M3 sway bars, ST Variant 3 coilovers, and a helical posse. Not sure what that means. Posi traction, like a diff. Okay.
Like a diff, yeah.
So I have room to play with variables. So basically he's got some adjustability. I don't know if the M3 sway bars are adjustable, but sounds like I believe he had the wagon. So some adjustability there.
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, that's all good stuff. So soften it up maybe. Tim Heaven's question, back to the talk. Tim, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. Back to the talk around Barber or Road Atlanta. Most listeners are DE, the details. Tim, I believe Ryan sent you some information on Road Atlanta. Both Robbie and I have put out content about talking around laps at Barber Road Atlanta. That's not what this webinar is for tonight, because you guys can see how much time we've already dedicated to the topics we've covered. Imagine if we talk about a racetrack. We'll be here till the early morning hours. But definitely check out Apex Pro on YouTube, and Ryan might drop some more videos into the links there. I know I did like a narrated lap video at Barber. That was actually super fun and pretty difficult, and worth doing. Tim Lambie says, Robbie, what are your tips for beginning and practicing to steer with the pedals more and less with the steering wheel and getting the car to rotate more?
Yeah. Great question. That's a great one. And honestly, that was a big turning point in my driving when I finally learned how to manipulate the weight of the car with the pedals. And mainly for me, that's with the brake. Andrew and I talked a lot about that in the braking webinar. So it's a good one to watch if you got some extra time. But to make a very long story short, let's say you're in a corner and you have your trajectory and your steering angle kind of set. The way that you trail off the brake, you should feel a change in how the front turns in, right? So let's say you're braking at a threshold and you start to turn in and you're on too much brake pressure for what the front tire can accept. As you turn and trail off the brake, you'll feel the car kind of rotate. So for me, when I started driving the MX-5 Cup car, in Skip Arbor, I was on a treaded street tire, a tire that liked a lot of slip angle to help rotate the car. And I would basically do all of the rotation with the brake release. So I would basically brake really hard in a straight line, get the threshold braking done, start to turn in with a little bit too much speed. I would overslip the front tire slightly, kind of not always intentionally, and then come off of the brake in such a way at the same, like I wouldn't even change my steering angle, right? I'd be on a trajectory, kind of going a little bit too far past the apex, and then use the brake release to almost over rotate the car because of the sort of tire that I was on. It was a BFG Comp 2 tire, but it had a very kind of large slip angle it liked, right? So I could turn the car, and I called it zero steering, right? I'm not changing my steering input, but I'm trailing off the brake, and I just feel the car like rotate a little bit.
Yeah.
And conversely, you never get that perfect, right? Always, but like at Laguna Seca is a good example into the corkscrew. If people know that corner, I would always carry way too much speed in there relative to what the tire could do, based on the angle I was on, and then change the trajectory of the car with the brake. And it's a technique that applies to what I do today, even though I don't on a Michelin or Pirelli racing slick tire on a big, high powered, big downforce GT car. The way I trail the brake and manipulate the slip limit of the tire is the same, but these tires these days and the race cars don't like a lot of slip angle, right? So for me, it's brake release and how I basically, from the point you just turn in to the apex, for me is where there was a lot of lap time when I was a younger driver, and where I find a lot of lap time in people that I coach, is all in the entry. Now, when you over rotate the car going to the apex and the car is kind of sliding and it's doing its turning and you're over rotating it, you can also catch the car with the rear by applying a little bit of throttle. And again, like a lot of things with racing, car setup, and car vehicle dynamics, it's a bell curve. If I just cover the throttle, I can catch the rear and settle it nicely, put a little bit of weight on it. If I do it too aggressive, I'll shock the rear tire and then snap and have a slide. So it's a very, very fine line.
Yeah.
And it's really all about weight transfer. But I could talk with this for hours, but check out that braking webinar, and there'll be some more detail on trail braking and things like that.
Ryan just copy and pasted the brake release webinar with Robby Foley. So that's a whole like hour-and-a-half long webinar.
Literally on just brake release and trail braking. So check that out for sure.
So much good stuff in there. And just to kind of summarize what I heard, Robby, to say it kind of differently, or something that I kind of learned from the way you described that, I might describe it differently, is when you're threshold braking, you're asking the tires to do everything they can do under deceleration. And then you begin to turn. And in order to kind of give the tires effectiveness to turn, you have to give the car back some grip by releasing the brake. So you've asked the car to turn 10 degrees of steering. It might only be turning at 5 degrees of steering because it's using all of its energy to brake. When you come off that brake pedal, you let the tires carve, right? You let them have tractive capacity to take lateral load and actually turn. If you come off the brake too quickly, then you unload them completely, right? And you lose that ability. And if you stay on the brake too long, then you're not going to, it's the same thing. It's the bell curve. You can be on either end of it. You want to be right in the middle.
For sure. Yeah. It's a string theory. If people have heard of that, it's a very detailed explanation of why that all makes sense. But yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll leave it here for our questions, guys. So if you have not submitted a question, just don't submit one. Maybe put it in an email and send it to apex@apextrackcoach.com, and we will forward those along to Robby and get you guys a response if you have any questions. But if you're going to put one in the Q&A box, just hold off for now, because we're over an hour already. Thanks for all the great questions. The next one says, how do you get started with sponsors, and how do you contact them? What do you say to them? So sponsorship 101. Got anything on that?
Very good question. To be honest, I am probably not the best I'm not terrible at it, but I was never one to overly seek out sponsorship. I know a lot of people that would do cold calls to companies. I did a lot of proposals to different companies. The one I guess I'd be most famous for, and that I was most disappointed in the outcome every single time, was I have to wear a brace on my leg. Well, I'm supposed to wear it all the time, honestly, but I don't. anymore. But when I work out or run, I wear this brace. It's called an AFO because I have foot drop in my left foot for my nerve damage. So I spent a ridiculous amount of hours creating a sponsorship proposal and kind of, a couple other different proposals for this company that made the brace. And there was quite a lot of deliberation, and anyway, it didn't end up going anywhere. They were a massive company and they sold more or less more products to paraplegic athletes that lost legs or limbs, and they made prosthetics for them where the market size for the thing I wore wasn't very big. But anyway, I don't think they quite realized the market that I could take them into. And for me, sponsorship these days is all about B2B. So I had this whole elaborate business plan of how I was going to connect this company to basically some existing companies I knew in composites, because my brace is carbon fiber, totally custom molded, and different injected composite materials. And as we know, race cars, the more carbon fiber they have, the cooler they are. So I knew a lot of people that made carbon fiber, and anyway, so I tried that to no success, right? So there's nothing guaranteed about sponsorship. I've also had situations where I can remember distinctly at one point in my career where I was meant to have a full season in something, and basically from a manufacturer, and that kind of, this was in my earlier career, and the money ran out like 3 races in, and I was coaching somebody and they helped me along to do like another race or 2. Which was great. And I've had personal sponsors. I've had a couple companies sponsor and different things, but I've never had a big corporate sponsorship deal yet. I'm still, I don't necessarily need one now, but it's always something you're working on, right? And I think the cool thing about racing, the commercial side of the sport is a little bit screwed up now in terms of, I think we can blame, but also thank social media for a lot of our problems, because information is so accessible now that companies are much less likely to put their logo on the side of a race car and entertain people that way, and or care about the TV numbers for a given race, because it's all about numbers. They can reach more eyes spending a lot less money than going racing. So that's hurt our sport. And yeah, there's much more, but saying that, racing offers basically an arena to do business deals with a lot of wealthy, successful people. So for instance, I thought I had a good thing going with basically making this brace company. I was essentially cutting their costs right down to their accounts payable and whatever. I thought it was a sure thing for them to do, and it wasn't. But there's a lot of business-to-business opportunities within racing, connecting different companies and different people together. So I think that's the basis of a lot of sponsorship deals you're seeing today.
Yeah, I think the and kind of actually differently than Robbie, the most of my professional racing that I did was funded by friends, family, and sponsors for different reasons. But what you have to think about with sponsorship is don't price what you're asking from somebody as far as dollars on what it costs you to race. Price it off of the value you can actually give them. And there is an advertising or a media value associated with the activities that you can do from racing, whether it be the physical branding that you can present on your car and all of that. That's a small value. The value you can present on social media, which actually is a tangible value now that you can track easily and hand to a company, and people will actually give you money because you reached several thousand people, which is not unheard of at all. But there's also a lot more value, like something that Apex Pro is willing to give somebody, and Pat and the guys from Turner can comment on, but if someone creates content for us that teaches people how to use your product, or places your product in a YouTube video in a positive light that adds some value to your customers for using it. Maybe you buy a sway bar from Turner Motorsports, and guess what? You're a really good video editor and you put together some awesome content on what this product does. That would cost me money otherwise for Apex Pro. Me and Ryan would have to go find somebody and pay them money to make this content for us. If you're willing to do it for free and show it to us as a sponsor, we'll give you free product, potentially cash, have some sort of, you sell an Apex Pro to a buddy, you get a referral fee, right? Just using us as an example, we do that all the time. And that's a very real form of sponsorship, because if you're going to the racetrack, you reach our customer base. And that's something that I would not undervalue, is that there's little things you're already doing that probably create some value for a sponsor. But if you're looking at sponsoring, funding a full season of professional racing, you need a 6-figure budget. More than likely, it's really hard to get that money if you're not already actively in racing and people can see you doing it. It's very hard to approach somebody, but also the main way that you're going to do that is appeal to someone's emotional, someone that has that amount of money, whether through their business or privately, that feels emotionally about this sport and wants to be more connected to it because they love it. And start there and then build out some sort of strategy that can kind of help their business if you're relying on that for funding. A lot of people that compete in the Indy 500 in a one-off ride, there's a couple of people that live in and around Indianapolis that want to be extremely involved with an IndyCar program. And for them, that's worth a lot of money and they contribute to it. So there's a million different reasons, and probably something we should do another webinar on, actually, Robbie, because when I think about it, I've actually raised a significant amount of sponsorship money. I just don't think of that as something that I really know how to do, but I guess.
Yeah, I've never necessarily thought about it, but I mean, there's been sponsors cultivated along the way that have helped me a lot, not necessarily through my own doing. It's kind of been a little bit circumstantial and right place, right time. But it's not a very clear-cut situation. NASCAR and IndyCar are the two biggest properties in America racing-wise. Then there's IMSA. There's definitely real sponsorship deals going on, but it's very hard for an individual to fund one entire program with one sponsor. So the business to business deals among companies are, I think, what you see the most common. And, if you can do a deal with a company and save them, $400,000, they'll probably give you $300,000 in sponsorship, that type of thing. They're getting something out of sponsoring you and your relationship. And there's a lot of different ways to skin the cat.
Yeah. And something to think about too is individually, and personally, what do you do in your personal life? This can even be for someone doing HPDE. What do you do business wise? Like something that how my dad helped me fund a lot of racing. Our primary sponsor was a bank, and my dad was a banker, and he helped this bank basically buy another bank, do a merger and an acquisition type situation. And because he worked for another bank, basically he couldn't get paid for this work that he did, all this pro bono work that he did to help them, just because he had friends on either end and he wanted to make it a good deal. And he didn't ask for this, but the goodwill from that was that the someone that was a part of the bank wanted to help contribute to my racing because they knew my dad cared about it. Right. And so there's kind of a goodwill in that. So think about, what do you already structure? And a lot of you probably are involved in a business at a high level in a way where you see some of the transactions, some of the ways that deals are made, decisions that are made on product lines, on services, on these other things. Could you be, instead of being paid a commission, could you be sponsored and have that done it's structured in a different way, because there's an extra element of value to attribute, if you give somebody a ride in your race car, right, that's involved with that company. If you want to take it seriously and you want to fund your racing through those avenues to reduce your cost, think about what you already do that you can leverage to help piece that together. I think Patrick posted something in the chat that's relevant to this, but most e-commerce companies use marketing dollars to fund affiliate programs these days. And it's a great way to grow in the grassroots from a funding perspective. You link to products you use and earn a percentage of the revenue for directing traffic. Yeah. So it's, if you have a following on social media, you can attribute, what you do to, affiliate links. Hey, check out my, I use Turner Motorsport products, check them out. Right. That creates real value, because anytime somebody watches a video and they're like, hey, I need to use what that guy's using, that's a value to companies like us, like Turner, that sell those products. It does rely on social media. Jared has a really good question. He's basically saying, I've been autocrossing for a while. I'm going to drive on the big track, road course, track days next year. Are there any bad habits I should be aware of? So for instance, gracefully moving towards threshold braking on the way into a big corner from high speed on a long track, as opposed to aggressive maximum application as late as possible in autocross. So what habits should he be aware of that he might have that might be of detriment to his track driving?
So it's an interesting question. I was thinking about it. It's so habits from a general standpoint, you could have aggressive inputs, and I'll get to why. But anyway, you could have aggressive inputs, kind of like a pitch and chuck mentality of like getting things done quickly, because in an autocross, things are happening more quickly. But the main difference is the corners have a larger radius. They're much bigger corners. Now, the technique and the theory and the physics behind what you're doing is the exact same. The thing that makes it much different in your brain is because it's happening a lot faster than autocross. But on a racetrack, you brake as hard as you can, as late as you can in a threshold braking situation, and you trail the brake. And in theory, the same way you would in an autocross, but given the parameters, it's a much different event. It happens much faster than autocross. In autocrossing, a lot of people are on and off the pedals like light switches. And you can find a lot of time in autocrossing by being a little bit more quiet. Like Jackie Stewart uses this term and in this video, and I always like it because he says you drive very quietly and blah, 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 in old F1 cars. But it's, if you drive a bit more quiet in an autocross, you won't shock the tire as much. And I bet you'd find a lot of time if you just took a step back and realized your inputs. But it's very easy in an autocross to stab the brake, get off, turn the wheel, smash the throttle. But the in-betweens on all those things, the trail off of the brake, the application into the throttle, the lift out of the throttle, the turn in, on a racetrack, you have more time to analyze it or more time to feel the difference, where in autocross, you're doing a lot, of more quick movements because of the nature of how quickly the corners come up. But I would say there's probably free time in autocrossing and being a little bit more in tune with the dynamics of the car and how they're interacting with the tire. There's probably thousandths of a second, hundredths of a second, where on a racetrack you'd find a couple tenths in a corner. But physics don't really change, and the tires you're on, you can be on a very similar tire in autocrossing, but it's the way that you as a human kind of perceive what's going on. So I would say your tendency might be to be a little over aggressive with your inputs and kind of throw the car around a little bit too much, because that's what you're used to feeling in the car in the autocrossing environment.
Man, I'm glad I'm recording this, because that's an excellent synopsis of that, Jared. I think I teach a novice classroom for the local Porsche club group as a volunteer every now and then. And you can definitely tell when drivers come in with a lot of autocross experience, because they usually are more comfortable getting up to speed and like driving the car more aggressively right off the bat. And you just have to kind of remind them that at higher speeds, you got to be softer. You got to be softer with all your inputs, right? You got to be a little more deliberate with like smoother vision, smoother hands, smoother feet. But I think to Robby's point, like the difference between, let's just use Ryan and I for an example. We did an autocross together, and we were both like two of the fastest overall in the modified PAX time, right? He was first overall. I was fourth in like a stock Honda Civic, Ryan's car, his daily, beating all these Miatas and stuff in the PAX time. And he was over half a second quicker than me on this short autocross course. And I guarantee you the difference was I was probably more aggressive on the inputs than he was. And he was a little softer, cut a little more distance, and enabled the car to carry a little more speed in places where I probably, because I just don't autocross as much, I'm going back to it. I'm like flipping that autocross switch of like, yeah, quick. Right. And I guarantee you that was the difference. And we looked at some of the data, and the biggest thing was he ran less distance over the course of the lap than I did. But I think that's like, that couldn't be more true. It's just being super aware of what kind of inputs you're giving the car and soften it up a little bit on the track, George Baker says, does DTC full on hurt you in an HPDE? So a DCT is BMW speak for full on stability control, right? Street stability control.
Yeah, good question. So I would say it doesn't hurt you in the way that it's the safest, most consistent way to drive the car. And you're less likely to spin or have an off or something like that with it. But for sure, one, it slows you down a little bit, because it'll never let you explore unless it's a really well track and race tuned version, it's not going to let you explore the full limits of the car and the tire. And beyond that, it can be a bit of a crutch for you. So if you're driving with it fully on, you can be full throttle in a corner and it's not giving you full throttle, or the car's pulling the brakes in different corners to keep you on the line or trajectory you need to be on. So when you then turn it off and you don't have it, you could be in a world of trouble where now the car's stepping out and you're not totally in tune with it. So I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with it in coaching, because I think it's a great tool because it's safe, and safety is number one. And a little mistake can really ruin your day that the traction control could cover, but also you're not learning 100% what you could be learning. So it's a balance for sure. Like when you're learning a new track, or the way I do it when I'm coaching some people, like we have these cars now at Turner, the M2 CS Racing BMW. I start with them fully on. They learn the track. We clean up the line, get everything kind of flowing get the basics down, right? The fundamentals. Then eventually we go to MDM, and then eventually maybe even off. But I would maybe challenge you to try that. If you're really feeling very comfortable, you can try a lesser setting, and then just be prepared that you have less intervention. So if you're full throttle at the apex of a corner, yanking the steering wheel, and you feel the thing like bucking around and whatever, you should know that like the car is driving you, it's totally saving you. So that, you'll get a bit more in tune with the car and what's going on if you turn that stuff off.
Yeah, I would also say, hiring somebody like Robby, like a professional coach that you get input from, not only is it worth its weight in gold, but that's somebody who can guide you on that process. Because what you don't want to do is go, I feel it coming in all the time, it's really limiting me. And your technique on the brake pedal, on the gas pedal, on the steering is all wrong. And you're going to overwhelm the tire and stuff it into a tire wall as soon as that. Some people drive that way because when you never drive without it, that can create that habit. That can happen. So exactly. The safe thing to do is have someone that you trust, who has a lot of experience driving, to come in and maybe give you a quick assessment of your driving and, hey, work on this before you pull it all the way off. If your brake release isn't softer or smoother or better, you might not want to just snap the traction control off. But I think a lot has to be said for Robby, like where someone like you started, like obviously karting and autocross, but obviously karts with no stability control, no traction control, no ABS even. There's not a lot of that for people getting into HPDE, track days, and autocrossing these days. Yep. And even though you and I are both way on the younger side of probably folks that are watching now, I didn't drive a car with ABS on the racetrack until I was 5 years into it. Yeah. And I'm sure you were kind of the same, right? So to me, ABS is still like, oh, cool. Yeah, we have this extra thing that helps. But I know what it's like without it.
I never drove a race car with traction control until I drove a GT3 car, I think. Because I went from MX-5 Miatas that had no TC or anything, had ABS, then went into a little bit quicker ST versions in IMSA. Again, no TC, just had ABS. Then the first prototype I drove was an LMP3, had no ABS or TC. So the first car I drove with TC was the first GT3 car I drove, a Mercedes in the Rolex 24 in 2018. So I'm definitely a proponent of driving without the aids, but at the same time, they're also a safer way to go, and they'll save you more times than not, for sure.
Yeah, and a lot of times too, I'm certainly not the. I think what you shared earlier about how the traction control, you guys are purely using it for pace, to go faster. So you're developing it to help you go faster, and that's how all the tools are. That's why we have paddle shifting. That's why we have the little steering wheel. That's why we, only use two pedals instead of three. All those things. But something to be said about a low-powered car with low consequences when you mess it up. The slower the car, the less horsepower, the less consequences. Low-powered car with a roll cage, like a Spec E46 BMW, a Spec Miata, Spec E30, all these low-cost spec class type cars that you see. If you're currently tracking something high-powered and fast, if you can rent, if you can afford to buy, or if you can get on track with a car like that for a few events, that's going to be really, really foundational learning experience. Where if you're in an NB Miata with 120 wheel horsepower and no ABS, it's really not a big deal not to have ABS or traction control.
Right.
And you'll learn stuff that you can apply to the other cars. But man, thanks for all the information, Robbie. We'll wrap it up real quick, but you have anything else you want to add? That was awesome.
Yeah, no worries. It was cool to do this and cool to connect different people. It's funny, like when Andrew and I met each other, I never would have thought that eventually he'd develop a product that, one of my race teams would sell, basically. So it's cool to connect, Apex Pro, myself, and Turner Motorsport. And I've had the fortune, good fortune to work with everybody involved. So it's quite cool to see it come full circle and chat about some driving on track. It's cool.
Yeah. Well, when we met, when I was 18 or 19 or whatever, I never thought you'd be a, paid professional full-time race car driver. I mean, I always had that thought, like it's possible, right? I probably actually knew the first time you coached me, I was probably like, this guy's, he's going to be a pro for sure. Like, but it is pretty cool to see it come full circle. So guys, if you're still engaged, we posted a bunch of links to Apex Pro products at Turner Motorsport. Turner Motorsport is a new dealer for Apex Pro as of this summer. They have the Apex Pro Gen 2 device, which has tons of features and benefits over and beyond what the original Apex Pro has. We have live telemetry, which Robbie, we need to talk about. But if you want to be able to see data from others or from yourself coming off in real time from your car, you can see speed and acceleration data as well as your car position on the track, and it laps overlay with themselves. If you don't know what I'm talking about, that's okay. If you do, it's an extremely, extremely cool feature. It works super well. If you have a driver coach, it's an essential feature. If you have some people that collaborate with you on your driving, you're on a Champ Car team. And then there's a lot of other benefits. So now, Robbie, on the Gen 2, you can see a predictive, like relative bar, like you have on iRacing, right? It's green faster, left red is slower.
I got to try that. That's awesome.
Yeah. So there's some other big value benefits. We have a new GPS antenna. So the antenna is actually better. So your GPS positioning, lap times, all the GPS related data is a little more accurate, a little bit better, longer battery life. It now tells you when it's charging, when it's not. So guys, make sure to check out Apex Pro at Turner Motorsport. And if you are on this webinar, you get 10% off Apex Pro products from Turner Motorsport. Just use the code FASTFoley in all caps. Ryan will drop it in the comments. We'll get an email out to everyone that registered to FastFoley, right? And Robbie, anything? Yeah, it does kind of have a ring to it. It alliterates, right? So use that for 10% off your Apex Pro products from Turner Motorsport. And Robbie, anything you want to add? I know you've probably a really busy schedule, but you also offer coaching. You work with folks privately as well. So anything you want to promote?
Yeah, I mean, you guys can follow kind of my racing and career if you want on Instagram or Facebook. Just look at my name and I do a lot of racing and coaching these days. So I always love connecting with different people and fans. So feel free to reach out for sure. But it's been fun. I enjoy doing these things. It's cool to interact with different people that all kind of have similar passion and interests. So always a good time.
Yeah, absolutely. Shoot Robbie a note, and you never know. If you're looking for a driver coach, you can hire somebody like Robbie. You can hire people that you watch on TV to help you, and I would definitely trust that. So awesome, Ryan. Am I forgetting anything? Just drop Robbie's Instagram link. Make sure to give him a follow. Killer follow. Awesome, cool. Well, thanks a lot for participating. We'll actually follow up. I'll post this, send it to the Turner guys. I'll post this on YouTube. You guys will be able to access if you want to watch this again. We had a lot of folks that couldn't join us tonight. This was really good time. Thanks again, Robbie.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me, guys.
Hopefully good luck at VIR this weekend.
Thanks. Yeah, leaving in a couple of days. So hopefully we can claw our championship lead that we lost back. But yeah, VIR this weekend. Looking forward to it.
You got it, man. Good luck.
Cool. Thanks.
All right. See you guys.